He was a ghost of the Rockies, a man so isolated, folks said he'd never even spoken to a woman, let alone touched one. Caleb Hayes was a giant, a virgin mountain man hiding from a world he didn't understand. But his solitude ended the night a blizzard brought her to his door. She was dressed as a nun, standing over 6 feet tall, with blood on her habit, and a past that would burn the mountain down. What happens when a man who has never known sin is trapped with a woman who has committed them all? And what did she really mean when she whispered that scandalous question in the dark? This is the true, untold story of the Saint of Granite Peak. Listen closely. The winter of 1883 was not merely cold. It was hateful. In the high territories of Wyoming, the wind didn't just blow. It screamed, peeling the bark off the pines and freezing a man's breath in his throat before he could finish a prayer. Caleb Hayes didn't pray much, though. Living alone at 8,000 feet on the jagged spine of Granite Peak, he found that God usually couldn't hear you over the wind anyway. Caleb was 34 years old, standing 6'5" in his stocking feet, with shoulders like a yoke for an ox, and a beard that hid a face scoured by windburn. To the few fur trappers who saw him once a year at the trading post in Bear Creek, he was a myth. They called him the Monk of the Mountain. They laughed, claiming he was a virgin who'd run up the mountain to escape a broken heart. They were half right. He was a virgin. But he hadn't run from a broken heart. He had run from the noise, the greed, and the sheer confusing chaos of civilization. He was shy, painfully so, and the solitude of the peaks was the only wife he had ever deemed necessary. Until the storm of January 12th. It was a whiteout blizzard, the kind that buried cabins whole. Caleb was checking his trap lines one last time, his snowshoes crunching heavily, when he saw the color. It was a stark, shocking black against the blinding white of the snowbank. He squinted, wiping ice from his eyelashes. It looked like a fallen crow, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something impossible. It was a person, a woman. She was face down in a drift, half buried. Caleb froze. He hadn't seen a woman in 10 years, not since his mother passed. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. What was he supposed to do? Duty overrode fear. He dropped to his knees, his massive hands trembling slightly as he brushed the snow from her back. She was wearing heavy wool, black wool, a habit. A nun? He whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. He turned her over, and then he gasped. She was massive. Even slumped in unconsciousness, she was long-limbed and solid. She wasn't a delicate little thing, like the porcelain dolls he'd seen in catalogues. She had a jawline that could cut glass and hands that looked like they'd worked a plough. Her face was pale, blue-lipped, framed by the wet wimple. But it was the red stain spreading across her midsection that snapped Caleb into action. She wasn't just frozen. She was bleeding. "Easy now, sister," he mumbled, mostly to calm himself. He scooped her up. He expected her to be heavy, and she was, a solid, dead weight of muscle and bone that surprised him. She was nearly as tall as him. He held her tight against his buffalo coat, shielding her from the biting wind, and turned back toward his cabin. For the first time in his life, Caleb Hayes was bringing a woman home. And the mountain, as if sensing the violation of his sacred solitude, howled louder. Inside the cabin, the silence was jarring after the roar of the storm. Caleb kicked the door shut and laid her on his narrow cot near the hearth. He stoked the fire until the logs cracked and popped, filling the room with orange light. He stood over her, wringing his massive hands. He had to check the wound. But she was a nun, a bride of Christ. To touch her seemed like a sin that would bring the roof down on his head. "Lord, forgive me," he muttered, "but she's bleeding on my quilt." With shaking fingers, he undid the heavy clasp of her cloak. He peeled back the layers of wet wool. The wound was on her side, a graze, likely from a bullet, though Caleb couldn't fathom who would shoot a nun. It was angry and inflamed, but the cold had slowed the bleeding. As he cleaned the wound with a rag dipped in whiskey, she stirred. A low groan escaped her lips. Caleb jumped back as if scalded, knocking over a tin cup. Clatter rang through the small room. The nun's eyes flew open. They weren't soft, pious eyes. They were grey, sharp, and terrified. She thrashed, her hand instantly going to her waist, searching for something that wasn't there. "Easy, easy, sister," Caleb stammered, holding his hands up, palms open. "You're safe. You're on Granite Peak." She blinked, focusing on him. Her gaze traveled up his massive frame, from his boots to his beard, and finally to his terrified eyes. "Who are you?" Her voice was husky, deeper than he expected. Caleb Hayes. I found you in the drift." She tried to sit up, but hissed in pain, clutching her side. "My gun. Where is my gun?" Caleb blinked. "Your gun?" "The Colt, Navy issue. It was in my belt." Caleb pointed to the table where he had laid out her wet things. A heavy iron revolver sat next to a rosary. The sight of the two objects side by side was jarring. "A nun with a 6-shooter, Caleb said, the awe plain in his voice. "Must be dangerous work, saving souls." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second the hardness in her face softened into something unreadable. She slumped back onto the pillow, letting out a long, ragged breath. "You have no idea, mountain man," she whispered. "You have no idea." 3 days passed. The storm outside refused to break, sealing the cabin in a tomb of snow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, boiling coffee, and the unacknowledged tension of 2 strangers trapped in a 12-by-12 room. Her name, she said, was Sister Beatrice. Caleb moved around her like a nervous bear. He slept on a pile of furs in the corner, giving her the bed. He cooked stew and fed her when she was too weak to lift the spoon, his face turning beet red every time his hand brushed hers. She was fascinating and terrifying. She was, as he had first noted, a giantess. When she finally stood up on the second day to test her legs, the top of her wimple nearly brushed the drying herbs hanging from the rafters. She was 6'1", barefooted. She moved with a prowling grace that didn't seem very nun-like. And she watched him, constantly. "You live up here alone?" she asked on the 3rd evening. She was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in her habit with his sewing kit. The firelight danced over her severe features, making her look less like a saint and more like a warrior queen from the old stories. Caleb was oiling his rifle, keeping his eyes strictly on the metal. "Yes, ma'am. Sister." "No wife? No children?" "No, ma'am." "Why?" Caleb paused. "People are complicated. Trees ain't." She let out a short, dry laugh. "Ain't that the truth?" She winced, shifting her leg. "How old are you, Caleb?" 34. "And no woman has ever snatched you up? A man your size? Hard worker?" She was teasing him. He could hear it in her tone, a low, smoky vibration that made the hair on his arms stand up. I ain't looked for one," he stammered. "Or maybe you're hiding." She put the needle down. "Like me." Caleb looked up. "I ain't hiding. I live here. You're the one with a bullet hole in your ribs, sister. Who shoots a nun?" She went quiet. The playfulness vanished. "Bad men, Caleb. Men who don't care about God or habits." "What men? I need to know if they're coming up my mountain." "They won't come up here in this storm. Not even Black Eye Bill Sterling would try it." Caleb dropped his rag. "Sterling? The marshal from Cheyenne?" She froze, realizing she'd said too much. "He's a wicked man, Caleb. Badge or no badge." Caleb stared at her. "He's the law. Why is the law shooting at a nun?" She looked away, staring into the flames. "Because I saw something I shouldn't have. And because maybe I wasn't always a nun." The confession hung in the air. Caleb felt a strange twisting in his gut. He knew he should press her, knew he should demand the truth. But looking at her profile, strong and vulnerable all at once, he couldn't do it. "Soup's ready," he said quietly. Later that night, the fever took her. It came on fast. 1 minute she was lucid, the next she was shivering so hard the cot rattled against the floorboards. Her skin was burning up. The wound had gone septic. Caleb was frantic. He stripped off his coat and piled every fur he owned on top of her, but she couldn't stop shaking. She was delirious, thrashing, throwing off the covers. "No, don't touch me," she moaned, her voice high and frightened. "Josiah, please." "It's Caleb," he soothed, dipping a rag in snow-melt water. "Just Caleb." He had to cool her down. He sat on the edge of the bed, dabbing her forehead. She grabbed his wrist with shocking strength. Her eyes were wide, but she wasn't seeing him. She was seeing ghosts. "Am I going to hell?" she gasped. "No, sister. You're good. You're safe." "I'm not good," she hissed, pulling his hand down to her chest, pressing it against the coarse wool of her habit, right over her beating heart. Caleb froze, his breath hitching. He had never touched a woman there. "I'm burning, Caleb. I'm burning up." "It's the fever," he choked out. "Make it stop," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. The grey was swirling with delirium and something else, something raw and desperate. "Can you make it stop? Can you—" She trailed off, her breathing shallow. Then she looked at him with a clarity that pierced him to the bone. She arched her back slightly, heat radiating off her in waves. "Can you make me come?" Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The words hung there, shocking and profane in the small cabin. He knew, or he hoped, she meant come back to reality. Or come out of the fever. But the way she looked at him, sweat glistening on her neck, her grip tightening on his hand, it didn't feel innocent. "Sister," he croaked, his face burning hotter than hers. "Come," she whispered again, her eyes fluttering shut as she slumped back, exhausted. "Come. Get me. Josiah." She passed out. Caleb sat there in the darkness, his hand still tingling where she had held it. He was sweating. He felt like he had just run 10 miles uphill. He pulled his hand back and clenched it into a fist. He was a virgin. He was a mountain man. He didn't know anything about women, about the games they played or the madness fevers brought. But looking at the giant woman sleeping in his bed, Caleb Hayes knew one thing for certain. The solitude of Granite Peak was dead. And if Marshall Sterling was coming for her, Caleb was going to have to do something he had never done before. He was going to have to fight a war. The sun broke through the storm clouds on the 4th morning, blinding and sharp against the snowdrifts that reached the cabin's eaves. Inside, the fever had broken. Caleb sat in his rocking chair, rifle across his lap, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He hadn't moved for 6 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice. "Can you make me come?" The words had burned a hole in his mind, confusing and shameful and thrilling all at once. A rustle from the cot drew his attention. Sister Beatrice was sitting up. She looked pale, her hair, which had come loose from the wimple, matted against her forehead. It wasn't black or grey like he expected a nun's to be. It was a rich, defiant auburn, like autumn leaves before the rot sets in. She looked at him, clear-eyed for the first time in days. Then she looked down at herself, checking the bandages. "You changed the dressing," she said, her voice raspy. "Had to," Caleb said, his voice tight. "You bled through." She nodded slowly. "Did I say anything while I was burning up?" Caleb gripped the rifle stock, his knuckles turned white. "You said a lot of things. You called for a man named Josiah." She flinched. The color drained from her face faster than the blood had. And you asked me a question." Caleb couldn't look at her. He looked at the fire. "You asked if I could make you come." Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Caleb waited for her to pray, to repent, to explain it as a religious vision. Instead, she laughed. It was a low, dry sound. "I see," she said. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, The heavy wool habit was twisted around her legs. With a sudden, violent motion, she reached up and tore the wimple from her head, throwing it onto the floor. Caleb stood up, alarmed. "Sister, stop calling me that," she snapped. She stood up, swaying slightly, towering in the small room. She began unbuttoning the heavy collar of the habit. "What are you doing?" Caleb took a step back, his face heating up. "I'm done lying to you, Caleb. You saved my life. You deserve the truth before Bill Sterling gets here and puts a bullet in both of us." She let the black dress fall to her waist. Beneath it, she wasn't wearing a hair shirt or simple linens. She was wearing a torn, silk corset and a man's flannel shirt that was stained with travel. "My name isn't Beatrice," she said, kicking the habit away like it was a snake. "It's Lottie Thorne." Caleb's mouth fell open. Even on the mountain, he'd heard that name. It was on wanted posters in the Trading Post. Lottie Thorne, the Omaha Black Widow, wanted for the murder of Senator Josiah Thorne. You killed a senator," Caleb whispered. "I killed a monster," she corrected, her eyes flashing dangerous fire. "Josiah was my husband. He liked to use his fists when the whiskey took him. He liked to use his belt when the whiskey ran out. I didn't shoot him for politics, Caleb. I shot him because he was strangling me." She took a step toward him. "I put on the habit to get out of Nebraska. I thought no one would look for a 6-foot-tall showgirl in a nunnery. I made it this far before Sterling caught my trail." Caleb stared at her. The saint he had saved was a wanted killer. A showgirl, a wife who had snapped. "And the question?" Caleb asked, his voice barely audible. "About making you come." Lottie looked at him, and for the first time her expression was soft. "I was dreaming I was dead, Caleb. I was stuck in the dark. I asked if you could make me come. Back to the light." She paused, tilting her head, looking at the giant, blushing man in front of her. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Though looking at you now, I suppose the other meaning wouldn't be the worst way to die." Caleb felt his heart stop. She was flirting with him. The Black Widow was flirting with the monk of Granite Peak. "I ain't never," Caleb started, then stopped. "I ain't like Josiah." "No," Lottie said, reaching out to touch his beard. Her hand was warm now. "You're the only decent man I've met in 10 years, and that is why you have to leave." "Leave?" "Sterling is coming. He's a tracker. He'll see the smoke. You need to go. Tell him you never saw me." Caleb looked at her. He looked at the door. He thought about the solitude he had cherished for so long. He could walk away. He could go back to being a ghost. He shook his head. "No. Caleb, this is my house," he said, his voice deepening into a growl that surprised even him. He walked over to the table and picked up her Navy Colt. He checked the cylinder, spun it, and handed it to her handle first. "And nobody dies in my house unless I say so." Lottie took the gun. Her fingers brushed his. The spark that jumped between them was hotter than the fire. "Then get ready, mountain man," she whispered, "because the devil is riding a horse, and he's almost here." 2 hours later, the sound of hoofbeats crunched over the hard-packed snow. Caleb stood on the porch, his buffalo coat buttoned to his chin, his Sharps buffalo rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. He looked calm, motionless as a statue. Inside his chest, his heart was hammering a war drum. A lone rider emerged from the tree line. The horse was black, breathing clouds of steam. The man in the saddle wore a long duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. A silver marshal's star glinted on his chest. It was Marshal Bill Sterling, or as the papers called him, the Hangman of Cheyenne. Sterling pulled his horse up 10 yards from the porch. He didn't draw his weapon. He just smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes that were dead and flat, like a shark's. "Morning, friend," Sterling called out. His voice was smooth, cultured. "Fine morning to survive a storm." "Morning," Caleb grunted. "Private land." "Is it?" Sterling looked around, mocking. Hard to tell where the land ends and the sky starts up here. I'm looking for a stray. A woman. Don't see many women up here. Sterling swung down from his saddle. He was a small man compared to Caleb, wiry and mean. He walked to the edge of the porch, his boots thudding heavily. "This one is hard to miss," Sterling said, leaning on the railing. "Tall, big girl, red hair, though she might be dressed up like a penguin. A nun, I mean." Caleb spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Haven't seen a nun since I was a boy in Kentucky." Sterling studied Caleb's face. He was looking for a twitch, a bead of sweat. Caleb gave him nothing but granite. "She's a killer, you know," Sterling said conversationally. "Killed a senator, a good man. She seduced him, married him, then shot him in his sleep. She's a whore and a liar. If you're hiding her, well, the law has strict penalties for aiding a fugitive." "I ain't hiding nothing but furs," Caleb said. "You want water for your horse, take it from the trough, then ride on." Sterling's smile vanished. He took a step up the stairs. "Mind if I look inside, just to be sure? It's a long ride back to town." "I do mind." Caleb shifted the rifle. It wasn't pointed at Sterling, but it was close. "I don't like company." Sterling stared at the rifle, then back at Caleb. He chuckled, a cold sound. "You're a big one, aren't you? A regular Goliath. I bet you get lonely up here. A woman like Lottie Thorne. She could tempt a saint. Did she tempt you, Goliath?" "Get off my porch," Caleb said. Sterling held his hands up in mock surrender. All right. I can see you're a man of your word." He backed down the stairs. "I'll check the ridge. But if I find out you lied to me, I'll come back, and I'll burn this shack down with you in it." Sterling mounted his horse. He tipped his hat, turned the beast, and rode back into the trees. Caleb waited until the sound of hooves faded completely. He counted to 100. Then he turned and opened the door. Lottie was standing behind it, the Colt pressed against her chest. She was trembling. "He's gone," Caleb said, letting out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 20 minutes. "He's not gone," Lottie said, her voice shaking. "I know Bill Sterling. He didn't believe you. He's just moving to high ground to get a shot." "Then we board up the windows," Caleb said, barring the door with a heavy oak beam. "And we wait." "Caleb," Lottie grabbed his arm. Her strength was returning. "Why did you do that? You could have given me up. He would have paid you a bounty." Caleb looked down at her. He thought about Sterling's shark eyes. He thought about the bruises Lottie had described on her body from her husband. "I don't like bullies," Caleb said simply, "and I don't sell people." Lottie stared at him, her eyes welling with tears. Suddenly she surged forward, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. Caleb froze. He had never been hugged. Not like this. Her body was pressed hard against his. He could feel the curves of her, the heat, the softness that belied her strength. His hands hovered in the air, unsure where to land. "Thank you," she muffled into his coat. "Thank you, Caleb." Slowly, awkwardly, Caleb lowered his giant hands. One landed on her shoulder. The other, tentatively, touched the small of her back. She gasped slightly at his touch, but didn't pull away. She squeezed tighter. "He's going to kill us," she whispered. "No," Caleb said, a strange, new confidence rising in him. He could smell her hair. Rainwater and fear. "I know this mountain. He's just a visitor. I'm the landlord. Underscore, 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 underscore." Night fell, bringing a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. They extinguished the lantern to avoid giving Sterling a target. The only light came from the dying embers of the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the floor. They sat on the floor, backs against the logs, shoulder to shoulder. The siege had begun. "You should sleep," Caleb whispered. "I'll watch." "I can't sleep," Lottie replied. She was cleaning her gun in the dark, her fingers moving by memory. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Josiah's face." Was he bad? Caleb asked. It was a child's question, but he didn't know how else to ask. He was the devil, Lottie said bitterly. He bought me from a saloon in Omaha, treated me like a prize horse, showed me off at parties, then beat me when we got home if I smiled at the wrong person. I didn't want to kill him, Caleb. I just wanted him to stop hitting me. She turned her head to look at him in the gloom. You don't know what that's like, do you, to be owned? No, Caleb admitted. I've always been free. Lonely, but free. I'd trade freedom for loneliness any day, she sighed. She shifted, her leg brushing against his thigh. The contact sent a jolt through Caleb that made him jump. Lottie noticed. She paused. You really are, aren't you? What? Touched. Innocent. A virgin. Caleb groaned, hiding his face in his hands. Do we have to talk about that? It's nothing to be ashamed of, she said softly. She put the gun down. She turned her body toward him. It's sweet. In my world, men take what they want. They use women like tissues. You're terrified to even hold me. I ain't terrified, Caleb lied. I don't want to break nothing. You're fancy, I'm just a mountain man. I am not fancy, Caleb. I am a fugitive murderer in a stolen flannel shirt. She reached out in the dark and found his hand. Her fingers interlaced with his. His hand swallowed hers. Caleb, she whispered. The tone of her voice changed. It wasn't the scared victim anymore. It was the woman who had survived saloons and senators. It was low, husky, and full of intent. We might die in the morning. Sterling doesn't leave witnesses. I know, Caleb said, his throat dry. I don't want to die remembering Josiah, she said. I want to remember something good. Something gentle. She leaned in. Caleb could feel her breath on his cheek. Lottie. Kiss me, Caleb, she commanded softly. Just once. Show me what a good man feels like. Caleb's heart was beating so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He turned his head. Her face was inches from his. In the ember light, her eyes were huge, searching. He didn't know what to do. He froze. So she did it for him. She reached up, her hand cupping his bearded cheek, and pulled him down. Her lips were soft, but the kiss wasn't timid. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of fear and desire. Caleb sat rigid for a second, overwhelmed by the sensation, the taste of her, the scent of her skin, the heat of her body pressing against his arm. Then instinct took over. A dormant part of his brain, ancient and buried under years of snow and silence, woke up. He made a low sound in his throat. He turned his body, his massive arm going around her waist, pulling her onto his lap. She was light as a feather to him. She gasped into his mouth as he deepened the kiss, his awkwardness vanishing under the sheer force of his need. For a minute, the storm outside didn't exist. Sterling didn't exist. There was only the fire, and the woman, and the realization that he had been starving for this his entire life. Lottie pulled back, breathless, her forehead resting against his. Her hands were gripping his shirt. You learn fast, mountain man, she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb struggled for words. I didn't hurt you. No, she said, tracing his lip with her thumb. You made me feel safe. That's more than any man has ever done. Caleb looked at her, his eyes fierce. Then I'm gonna keep doing it. I'm gonna keep you safe, Lottie. Even against Sterling. Sterling is a man, Caleb said, reaching for his rifle with one hand while keeping the other firmly on her waist. And on this mountain, men break before the rocks do. A sudden crash echoed from the back of the cabin, wood splintering, glass shattering. Lottie screamed. Back door! Caleb roared, shoving her off his lap and rolling toward the hearth. A canister came flying through the broken window, clattering across the floorboards. It hissed, spewing thick white smoke. Dynamite? Lottie cried. No, Caleb coughed, eyes watering instantly. Smoke! He's smoking us out. Like badgers. If we go out, he shoots us, Lottie choked. If we stay, we suffocate. Caleb grabbed a wet blanket from the bucket and threw it over Lottie's head. He grabbed his axe. We ain't doing neither, Caleb growled. He looked at the floorboards in the corner, where the root cellar hatch was hidden under a rug. We're going down. And then, I'm going hunting. The smoke was thick as wool, acrid and blinding. It stung their eyes and sealed their throats. Caleb moved by pure instinct, kicking the braided rug aside and yanking up the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor. "Down!" he roared over the hissing of the smoke canister. Lottie didn't hesitate. Clutching the wet blanket around her shoulders and her Colt in one hand, she dropped into the black square in the floor. It was a 4-foot drop onto packed earth. Caleb threw his axe down, then followed, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut above them. The slam echoed in the tight space, momentarily cutting off the worst of the smoke. The wisps curled down through the cracks like white snakes. They were in total, suffocating darkness. The air below was cold, smelling of damp earth, potatoes, and ancient dust. "Lottie," Caleb whispered, reaching out blindly. "I'm here." Her hand found his forearm, her grip vice-like. She was shivering violently, but he couldn't tell if it was fear or the lingering effects of her fever. "We're trapped, Caleb. It's a root cellar. There's no way out." "There is," Caleb said, his voice reverberating strangely in the tight space. "It ain't just a cellar." He pulled her deeper into the darkness. The space felt narrow, dirt walls brushing their shoulders. 70 years ago, Caleb murmured, guiding her with a hand on her back. Spanish prospectors dug all over this ridge looking for silver. They didn't find much, but they left holes. When I built the cabin, I built it right over one of their old drifts, used it for cold storage. They were walking down a slight decline now. The air grew colder, wetter. The smell of root vegetables faded, replaced by the mineral tang of deep rock. "Where does it go?" Lottie whispered. The total absence of light was terrifying her more than Sterling's gun. "It punches out the side of the cliff face, about 200 feet down the ravine. It's a tight squeeze, and it's covered in brush on the outside. Sterling won't know it's there." "Then we run?" Caleb stopped. The silence of the underground was immense, heavy. "You run," Caleb said. "The snow is deep in the ravine. It'll break your fall coming out. Head north. Follow the creek bed. It'll take you toward Montana territory." Lottie jerked her hand away from his. "What? No, I'm not leaving you. Sterling wants you. If you're gone, he has no quarrel with me." "You're a terrible liar, Caleb Hayes," she hissed in the dark. "He knows you helped me. He's going to burn your cabin and shoot you for sport. You said we were doing this together." "Lottie, listen to me. He's a killer. I'm just a trapper." "You're more than that," she said fiercely. She reached out and found his face in the dark, her hands cupping his beard. "Up there, when you kissed me. You weren't just a trapper then. You were the man who saved me. Don't you dare send me away now." Her belief in him, so absolute in the terrifying dark, staggered him. He covered her hands with his own massive ones. "All right," he rumbled. "All right. We stick together." "So what's the plan, Mountain Man?" "Sterling is impatient. He won't wait for the fire to burn down. When he realizes we ain't coming out coffin, he'll come in. He'll see the hatch." Caleb turned his head, looking back the way they came, though there was nothing to see. "Up there, in the light, he's the law," Caleb whispered, a cold edge entering his voice that Lottie had never heard before. "But down here, in the dark, this is where the mountain keeps its secrets. Down here, he's just meat." He let go of her and moved to the wall of the tunnel. He felt around until his fingers brushed cold metal. His axe. He hefted it. "Stay behind me. Keep one hand on my belt loop. Don't make a sound. We're going back toward the hatch." "Back? Why?" "We ain't running, Lottie," Caleb said into the blackness. "We're hunting." Above them, the cabin was dying. They heard heavy boots thudding on the floorboards overhead, coughing, cursing. "Hayes, come out, you dumb son of a bitch! You can't hide in the smoke forever!" Sterling's voice was muffled by the trap door, but the rage in it was clear. Caleb and Lottie pressed themselves into a small alcove cut into the dirt wall of the tunnel, about 20 feet from the ladder leading up to the hatch. Caleb stood in front, the axe held across his chest. Lottie was behind him, the Colt cocked, the metallic click sounding impossibly loud in the silence. They waited. Minutes stretched like hours. The heat from the burning cabin above began to seep down, warming the stagnant air. Then the trap door ripped open. A square of orange, smoky light appeared in the ceiling of the tunnel. A figure stood silhouetted against the blaze. "Well, well," Sterling's voice echoed down. "A rat hole. Very clever, Goliath." Sterling didn't just jump down. He was too cautious for that. He dropped a lantern first. It hit the dirt floor and rolled, casting wild, swinging shadows down the corridor. The light revealed the tunnel, rough-hewn timber supports, dripping rock walls. It barely reached Caleb and Lottie's hiding spot. Sterling descended the ladder, slowly, his gun drawn. He stepped away from the lantern, kicking it further down the tunnel so he wasn't standing in the light. "Lottie!" he called out, his voice echoing weirdly. "Come on out, sweetheart. Let's finish this. You know you can't outrun me." Caleb didn't move. He barely breathed. He had spent days sitting motionless in snow blinds waiting for elk. He could outwait a Cheyenne marshal. Sterling began to move deeper into the tunnel, away from them. He saw the footprints heading toward the ravine exit. "Gonna try the back door, huh?" Sterling muttered, starting to walk past their hiding spot. He passed them, now. Caleb stepped out from the alcove, silent as a shadow. He didn't raise the axe to strike. He reached out with his gigantic hand and grabbed Sterling by the back of his duster coat. Sterling yelped in genuine shock. Before he could turn, Caleb swung him around and slammed him into the timber support beam. The impact was sickening, a wet thud of bone against wood. Sterling's gun went flying into the darkness. He crumbled to his knees, groaning, stunned. Caleb loomed over him, a giant silhouetted by the distant lantern light. "I told you," Caleb growled, his voice low and terrifying. "Private land." Sterling shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs. He looked up at Caleb, blood trickling from his hairline. And then, incredibly, he laughed. It was a wet, gurgling sound. "You big, dumb brute," Sterling wheezed. He fumbled inside his duster. "Don't!" Lottie screamed, stepping out from behind Caleb, raising her Colt. But she was too slow. Sterling wasn't reaching for a badge. He was reaching for a hideout gun, a small, double-barreled Derringer concealed in his sleeve. He didn't aim. He just pointed it up at the massive shape above him and fired both barrels. The boom was deafening in the confined space. Caleb roared, a sound of surprise and pain, and staggered back. He dropped the axe, clutching his left shoulder. "Caleb!" Lottie cried out. Sterling scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild. He looked at Lottie, then at the wounded giant, and he sneered. "You should have stayed in the whorehouse, Lottie," Sterling spat, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. "Josiah was soft. I'm not." He lunged. Not at Caleb, but at Lottie. He was fast, faster than Caleb had anticipated. He closed the distance before Lottie could steady her aiming hand. He slapped the Colt away. It spun across the dirt floor. He grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against the rock wall. Lottie fought back, scratching at his eyes, kicking, but his grip was iron. "You think you're free?" Sterling hissed into her face, his breath smelling of whiskey and hate. "You belong to me. You always have, since the day I saw you on that stage." It wasn't about the law. It wasn't about murder. It was about ownership. Lottie's vision began to blur. She saw the glint of the knife blade raising up. Then the mountain fell on Bill Sterling. Caleb, ignoring the blood pouring from his shoulder, slammed into Sterling from the side like a charging grizzly. The force of it tore Sterling off Lottie. The two men crashed to the ground, rolling in the dirt in a brutal, desperate tangle of limbs. Sterling was quick and vicious with the knife, slashing wildly. Caleb was sheer, raw power. He didn't feel the cuts. He just roared and hammered his fists into Sterling's face, over and over. It ended quickly. Caleb grabbed Sterling's knife hand, twisting it until the bone snapped with a loud crack. Sterling screamed. Caleb wound up and delivered one final massive punch that knocked the marshal flat on his back, unconscious. Caleb stood up, swaying. His breath was ragged. His shirt was soaked in blood on the left side. Lottie pushed herself off the wall, gasping for air. She looked at Caleb, then down at Sterling's still form. Sterling groaned. His eyes fluttered open. He wasn't dead. He looked up at them, his face a ruined mask of blood. You can't, Sterling spluttered weakly. I'm a United States Marshal. You kill me. They'll send an army. They'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. Caleb looked down at him. The rage had drained away, leaving only a terrible, cold clarity. Let them come, Caleb said. Sterling tried to sit up, reaching feebly toward his boot, perhaps for another hidden weapon. A gunshot rang out, sharp, final. Sterling jerked violently back onto the dirt, a neat hole right between his eyes. Caleb spun around. Lottie was standing there, holding the Navy Colt she had retrieved from the darkness. Smoke curled from the barrel. Her face was hard, dry-eyed, stripped of all fear. She looked at the dead man, then at Caleb. He was right about one thing, she said, her voice devoid of trembling. Josiah was soft. She holstered the gun, walked over to Caleb, and gently placed a hand over his bleeding shoulder. We have to go, Caleb, before the fire burns through the floor. Caleb nodded slowly. He took one last look at the life he was leaving behind. The cabin burning above, the solitude shattered. Aye, he whispered. Let's go. They emerged from the side of the cliff 2 hours later. The storm had finally broken. The moon hung huge and silver over a world buried in white. The air was so cold it felt brittle, threatening to crack with every breath. Behind them, a faint orange glow pulsed against the clouds near the peak. Caleb's cabin, his past, cremated. They stopped in a thicket of aspens near the frozen creek bed. Lottie made Caleb sit on a fallen log. Let me see it, she commanded softly. She peeled back the layers of his blood-crusted shirt. The derringer balls had hit the meat of his shoulder. It was messy, and it would scar bad, but it hadn't hit bone or artery. He would live. She tore strips from the hem of her flannel shirt, Josiah's shirt, and bound the wound tightly, her hands skilled and gentle in the moonlight. When she was finished, she didn't pull away. She stood between his knees, her hands resting on his massive shoulders. He looked up at her. His beard was frosted with ice, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and a profound new sadness. You lost everything, Lottie whispered. Your home, your peace. Because of me. Caleb shook his head slowly. He reached up and took one of her hands, marveling again at how small it felt in his. I didn't have peace up here, Lottie. I just had quiet. There's a difference. He rubbed his thumb over her knuckles. And I didn't lose everything. I found something in a snowbank. Lottie's eyes welled up, finally. The hard shell she'd built around herself cracked. She leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't desperate like the kiss in the cabin. It was slow, deep, and full of a promise of a future that an hour ago had seemed impossible. Where do we go? She asked, resting her forehead against his. Sterling was right. If they find his body, they'll never stop looking. Caleb looked north, toward the endless, jagged expanse of the Canadian Rockies gleaming in the moonlight. A land wilder, colder, and emptier than Wyoming could ever dream of being. A place where a man and a woman could disappear completely. North, Caleb said. Past the maps, past the law. It'll be hard living, she warned. Caleb Hayes, no longer the virgin monk of the mountain, but a man with a scar on his shoulder and a woman by his side, stood up. He towered over her, casting a long shadow across the snow. I like hard living, he rumbled, pulling her against his good side, as long as I ain't living alone. They turned away from the dying fire on the peak and started walking, leaving 2 sets of footprints, one massive, one long and slender, heading into the vast, silent white of the northern wilderness. By morning, the wind would cover their tracks, and the ghosts of Granite Peak would be gone forever. Caleb and Lottie were never seen in the Wyoming territories again. Some say they died in the cold that winter. Others say if you travel deep enough into the Canadian Yukon, you might find a cabin built by a giant, where a red-haired woman cleans a Navy Colt by the fire. But those are just stories. The truth remains buried under the snow of Granite Peak. What do you think happened to them? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry.